Hey, sleepyheads. Welcome to Dreaming Through Ages, a place where we gently wander through stories lost in time. Stories wrapped in snow, silence, and memories. I know you've had a long day. Maybe it was hard. Maybe you carried too much. But now you're here. You're safe. You're calm. And you can let go. Let your breath slow. Feel your eyes get heavy. And just listen. We're about to travel far, not by feet, but by dreams. Close your eyes. Tonight we begin in the heart of old Russia, in a palace made of frost and forgotten love. Long ago, in a land ruled by silence, where snow fell like whispers from the sky, there stood a palace of white stone and gold. It was tall, proud, lonely. Its towers rose like icicles toward the pale gray sky, and its windows glowed like lanterns in the never-ending winter. Inside, the floors were cold marble. The halls were wide and empty, echoing only with the sound of wind slipping through cracks. Outside the walls, trees stood still, frozen in place as if the world had stopped breathing. Time didn't move fast here. It drifted like flakes in the wind, soft, quiet, almost forgotten. In the center of this frozen kingdom lived a queen. But she was not the queen the world remembers from books. Her name was Anastasia, not the bold Anastasia of legend. This Anastasia was gentle, thoughtful, and very, very quiet. She had eyes the color of mist over water, and hair as dark as midnight crows. She moved slowly, as if every step was part of a dream. She ruled kindly, but not loudly. And while her crown shimmered in sunlight, her heart often wandered into shadow. She didn't long for power. She longed for something else, something warmer than marble, something softer than snow. Each evening, as the sky turned purple, the queen would walk alone through the palace. She'd trace her fingers along frozen window panes and listen to the creaking hush of the building as it settled into night. The servants kept their distance, not out of fear, but out of respect for her quiet. They said she often spoke to the moon. Others said she spoke to someone else entirely. Someone they could never see. No one really knew. But if you listened closely, you might hear her whisper a name, faint as if carried from another world. Behind the palace there was a garden, but it was not green. It was white. Frozen flowers locked in bloom, crystal-coated branches that never moved. Even the fountains stood still, trapped in the middle of their own flowing beauty. And yet, the queen visited this place every morning. Wrapped in thick furs, she would sit on a marble bench beside the central fountain and close her eyes. Was she remembering something? Or dreaming something new? The guards didn't know. They only knew this was sacred space. No one spoke while she was there. Even the wind seemed to pause. Anastasia had grown up in this palace. The snow had always been there. The silence had always been there. She had learned to read by the fire, to ride horses across frozen lakes, to dance in empty halls, and to speak in ways that didn't need sound. They say the cold made her strong, but it also made her lonely. She had no sisters, no brothers, only tutors, guards, and cold winter days. But sometimes, late at night, she would sneak out of her chambers, barefoot on the stone, and lie beneath the stars. She believed dreams traveled on starlight, and if she stayed still long enough, maybe a dream would find her. There had once been music in the palace, grand balls, waltzes, laughter. But those days were gone now. The music had faded like breath on glass. Still sometimes, just sometimes, as the snow fell gently outside, the Queen would play the piano alone. Slow, sad notes that floated like feathers. The kind of songs that made your heart feel like it remembered something, even if you didn't know what. One morning, while walking her garden path, Anastasia found something she had never seen before. A single red flower blooming in the snow. It stood tall, proud, as if the cold had no power over it. She knelt beside it, touched its petals. Warm, alive. She looked around, but there was no trail, no footprints, no reason for it to be there. And yet, she smiled, because somewhere inside her, something old had stirred. A memory, or maybe a prophecy. The flower bloomed red and radiant, and something inside the Queen began to bloom with it. That night, she didn't walk the palace halls alone. Instead, she stayed near her window, watching the garden below, waiting to see if the flower would remain or disappear with the frost. But by morning, it was still there, and beside it was something new. A small piece of parchment, curled by the wind, pinned down with a stone. No royal wax, no signature, just a sketch. A rose drawn with the charcoal and care. Anastasia looked at it for a long time, her heart slow, yet heavy with something it hadn't felt in years. She folded the drawing gently and tucked it into the sleeve of her gown. For the first time in many winters, she smiled as she walked back inside. The next morning, another sketch appeared. This one was of the fountain, but not how it looked now. Instead, it was drawn as if it were flowing freely, alive, unfrozen. As if someone remembered the garden before it turned to ice. And so a silent exchange began. Each morning, she found another drawing. Sometimes a flower, sometimes a face. Once she found a bird flying. She hadn't seen a bird in the palace gardens in over 10 years. No name, no voice, just lines on paper. But they spoke to her, in a language older than speech. And still no one had seen who left them. Anastasia began leaving something of her own in return. A pressed petal, a poem in her own careful handwriting, a ribbon from her childhood. Her replies were just as silent, but no less full of wonder. Winter deepened, but her heart grew lighter. And then, one day, instead of a drawing or a poem, she found something else. A figure, standing quietly near the tree line, his coat the color of ash and bark, a satchel slung across his shoulder. He didn't speak. He only nodded, as if to say, "Yes, I am the one." Anastasia didn't move at first. She only watched, and then she stepped forward. The snow between them crackled softly as she drew closer. He looked older than her, but only slightly. His eyes were the color of honey touched by firelight, and when he smiled, she felt it warm the cold air between them. "You are the painter," she said softly. "I am," he replied. "Why now?" she asked. And he answered, "Because the snow finally listened." They stood in silence for a long time. No guards, no court, no world between them. Just two people in a garden that had long been asleep. He introduced himself as Luca, not an official court artist, not a noble, just a man who once dreamed of painting something real. "And what is real to you?" the Queen asked. He pointed to the garden. "Not the flowers," he said, "but the fact that you come to see them anyway." That was the moment it began, not with music or letters or declarations, but with stillness and snow and two people who understood quiet. Luca did not speak often, and neither did Anastasia. But when they walked together, words weren't needed. He would bring sketches. She would bring tea. And sometimes they would sit in silence for hours, watching the clouds drift over the frozen palace roofs. He drew her once without asking. She didn't know until she saw it, her face captured not with perfection, but with understanding, eyes full of longing and peace. When she saw the drawing, she said only, "That's not how I look." And he said, "It's how you are." Something changed after that. Not in the palace, not yet, but inside her. She laughed once at a story he told. The sound startled the guards. They hadn't heard it in years. He told her of warm places where winter was only a word, of colors that had no name, of a place where rivers sparkled like sunlight caught in a net. And though she had never left her kingdom, she began to dream of other lands, and just by listening to him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the icy hills, she asked him, "Why me?" He didn't answer for a long time. But when he did, he said, "Because everything around you is frozen, and still you bloom." Anastasia didn't know what to say, but her heart did. It beat stronger that night, and her sleep was deeper, as if something in her soul had unclenched. The next morning, the palace staff noticed something odd. The queen was humming, a song no one recognized. But it was soft and sweet, and it sounded like spring. The headmaid whispered, "She's in love." And the kitchen boy said, "She's dreaming again." They didn't know how right they were, because dreams had returned to the snow-covered kingdom. And love, soft, secret, and strong, had begun to melt the ice around a queen's tired heart. That winter, the snow didn't feel as cold. Anastasia began waking earlier, just to walk through the white garden before anyone else stirred. Sometimes Luca would already be there, sometimes not. But always, she felt he had just been. The silence they shared wasn't empty. It was full of meaning, like the hush before a song begins, or the pause before two hands meet. He showed her drawings from other places, of fields golden with wheat, of oceans that stretched beyond the sky, of people dancing under lanterns in the night. She listened like a child discovering a new story, and sometimes she closed her eyes and imagined herself inside those drawings, not as a queen, not as royalty, just as a woman with bare feet and wind in her hair. There was one sketch she kept hidden in her desk. It showed her, not in furs or jewels, but in a simple linen dress, sitting beneath a tree reading a book. It was how she imagined herself, in a world without palaces. Luca had drawn it from memory, after a dream he said he had. He said he liked drawing dreams, because they were the only truths no one else could steal. That line stayed with her, and she repeated it to herself often. Dreams are the only truths no one can steal. The days passed slowly, but each one left behind a trace, a memory, a sketch, a glance held longer than before. One day, as they sat near the frozen fountain, Anastasia turned to Luca and asked, "Do you think the snow will ever melt?" He looked at her, not at the garden. "In some places," he said, "it already has." The weight of those words wrapped itself gently around her heart. Not everything had to change at once, but something inside her already had. Still, they were careful, always careful. The palace was a place of watchful eyes. Even the walls whispered. Even silence had ears. She knew if the court ever discovered this growing closeness, they would call it scandal. They would call it treason. They would take him away and bury the story with him. But feelings do not ask permission, and love, when quiet, grows deep roots. That night, Anastasia stood by her window again. The snow was falling softly, a slow, drifting curtain of white. She wrote a letter, just a short one. It said only, "Come tomorrow, I have something to ask you." She folded it carefully. No seal, no name. Just a thread of red silk tied around it. In the morning, he found it beneath the garden tree, where she always left her replies. And he came. That afternoon, they walked together, not just around the garden, but beyond it. Past the statues, past the wall of vines frozen stiff in place, to a quiet glade where the palace could no longer be seen. It was the furthest she had gone in years. She felt like a girl again, not a queen. Just someone chasing a feeling. She turned to him and said, "If I asked you to take me far away, would you?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes." She looked down. "But I can't ask you that." "Not yet." He stepped closer. "Then I'll wait until you can." And for the first time, she reached for his hand. It was warm, rough from charcoal, but steady. They stood there, hand in hand, as the snow fell gently around them. No one watching, no words needed. Only two people, connected in a moment. That felt like forever. Later that evening, she returned to the palace, her hair wet from snow, her cheeks pink with cold. The courtiers noticed. The servants noticed. Even the king's advisor noticed. But no one dared ask. Because queens are allowed secrets. And this one was too beautiful to break. In her chamber, Anastasia lit a single candle. She stared into the flame for a long time. And then she whispered to it, as if it could carry her message through time itself. "Don't take him from me. Please, not yet." The candle flickered, but didn't go out. And somewhere deep in the palace garden, a single rose bloomed again, in the middle of winter. The next day, Luca brought her a painting. Not a sketch, not a drawing, a full painting, done with slow hands and love. It showed the two of them, standing in snow, surrounded by soft light and silence. He titled it, "The Stillness Before Spring." She wept when she saw it. Not loudly, not broken, just quiet tears that tasted like hope. Because deep inside her, for the first time in years, she truly believed spring might come again. They say the snow is silent, but sometimes it carries whispers. The queen's heart had begun to glow, like a candle behind frosted glass, soft, warm, flickering in the stillness. She smiled more often now. Her steps were lighter. She no longer walked the halls like a ghost of royalty, but like a woman returning from a long, lonely dream. Yet something lingered beneath the joy, a shadow at the edge of the light, a reminder that not all stories are allowed to bloom. One morning, as Luca painted beside the garden bench, Anastasia leaned over and asked softly, "Do you ever wonder if all this is just a dream?" He paused, brush in hand, and answered gently, "If it is, then I hope we never wake up." She closed her eyes, letting his words drift through her like a breeze. But dreams, no matter how beautiful, are always chased by the dawn. That week, the king returned from a political journey. Tall, sharp, and quiet, he was a man more feared than loved. He ruled with precision, rarely raised his voice, rarely smiled. But everyone in the palace knew his silence was not peace. It was control. Anastasia did not flinch when he entered the great hall. She stood by his side, played her role, spoke with grace. But inside, she felt herself vanish. That night, she stood again by the frost-covered window, watching the snow fall as if it were hiding her heart. Luca did not come the next morning, nor the one after. The red flower was gone. The sketches stopped. And though she said nothing, everyone noticed the quiet had returned. Days passed. The queen's light dimmed. Then one night, a knock on her door. 3 soft taps, the rhythm she knew. She opened it without hesitation. There he was. Luca. Cold. Breathing fast. Eyes filled with something that wasn't fear, but urgency. "I've been sent away," he said. "Who sent you?" she whispered. He didn't need to answer. Of course, it was the king. Luca took her hands, gently as if they might break. "I will go," he said. "But before I do, you must know something." Anastasia nodded slowly, eyes stinging. "I have loved you," Luca said, "from the moment you looked at that first sketch, as if it were something more." "I know," she whispered. "I have loved you too." A silence fell between them, full of everything they could not say. Then he reached into his coat, and pulled out one final drawing. It was unfinished, just her outline, standing in the snow. But there was something different. No crown, no weight, just her, free. "Finish it," he said softly, "when the snow melts." He kissed her hand, not like a subject to a queen, but like a soul to its mirror. And then he was gone. She stood in the doorway for a long time, not moving, not breathing, until the wind whispered through the hall and closed the door for her. The next day, she woke early, dressed without help, walked to the garden. The snow had covered everything again. The rose, the sketches, the footprints, all gone. Only the unfinished drawing remained, pressed between the pages of her journal. That evening, at the royal banquet, she wore black instead of royal blue. The court murmured. The king noticed, but she did not explain. Because grief is not always loud. It often lives quietly, beneath jewels and titles, in the space between breath and silence. As the music played, she closed her eyes and remembered his hand, his eyes, his voice. He had loved her, truly. And that was something the snow could never bury. The snow kept falling. Time, like the frost on the palace windows, slowed. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. But for Queen Anastasia, time didn't move forward. It folded in on itself. Like pages of a book she could no longer read, because the part she loved most had been torn out. She still ruled, still smiled, still wore her crown, but something had changed. Her steps were quieter, her eyes a little softer, her words fewer but deeper. She had become a woman who had loved and lost, but never forgotten. In her private chamber, beneath a floorboard only she knew, lay the final sketch, unfinished, untouched. She had not dared to complete it. Not yet, because doing so might mean letting go. Each evening she sat by her window, looking not at the stars, but at the tree line where Luca once stood, hoping. perhaps foolishly. But love makes fools of queens, just as it does of poets. She never heard from him again. No letters, no rumors, no word at all. Some said he had fled to the south. Others said he had been taken by the king's men. A few believed he had died in the snow. But Anastasia, she believed none of it. She believed he was still painting somewhere, still breathing, still dreaming of her. Because how could something that felt so real just disappear? One night she asked her reflection, "Am I still a queen if the only thing I rule is memory?" The mirror gave no answer. But outside, the snow began to fall heavier, as if to bury the question. Years passed. The court changed. Faces came and went. The king grew older, quieter, or more distant than ever. Anastasia's beauty faded, but her presence deepened. She became a figure of myth inside her own castle, a queen who spoke to no one, but remembered everyone. She still walked the garden, even when it hurt her knees, even when no flowers bloomed. And every winter, she lit a single candle and placed it by the tree where the red rose once grew. No one dared touch it. Even the new servants knew it was sacred. And once, on a particularly quiet night, a young maid passing through the garden swore she saw a man in a long gray coat standing just beyond the trees. When she blinked, he was gone. But the next morning, Anastasia smiled. Just a little, not loud, not wide, just enough for herself. She knew what she had seen, or maybe what she had felt. Because grief does not always leave. Sometimes it becomes a second heart, beating quietly beneath the first. And love, true love, never really dies. It waits, in silence, in dreams, in snow. Anastasia kept a journal in her final years, a quiet record, not of the court, not of the kingdom, but of him. Each page began the same. Today, I remembered him. And each page ended the same. And I still will. Tomorrow. She wrote until her hands shook too much, until her breath became short, and her nights became longer than her days. But she never stopped visiting the garden, and she never once finished that painting. Because in her heart, that final stroke belonged to him. Winter came again. The palace was quiet. Not the cold silence of loneliness, but the sacred hush that follows a full life. A quiet that says, "Rest now. You've remembered enough." Anastasia was older. Her hair had turned silver, matching the world outside her window. But her eyes, they had stayed the same, still soft, still searching. She spent most days by the fire now, her lap covered in old letters, half-written poems, and small sketches she had drawn from memory. Sometimes she would trace her finger along the edge of the last painting, the unfinished one, the one Luca had given her. She never painted over it. She never added to it. Because some things are meant to remain as they were, untouched by time. On the last night of her life, she asked to be left alone. The servants obeyed. The doctor stepped back, and the fire was left burning low. She sat upright in bed, wrapped in a pale blue shawl. The sky outside was dusted in stars. Snow fell gently against the glass. And then, her breathing slowed, her hands relaxed, and a small smile crept across her lips. Because in that final moment, she saw something no one else could see. A man, in a gray coat, standing just beyond the trees. Warm eyes, a gentle smile, and an outstretched hand. She rose, not in body, but in something softer, lighter, truer. She walked past the window, through the halls of memory, into the garden once again. It was spring there. The fountain was flowing, the flowers alive, the snow gone. And Luca stood waiting, beneath the tree where it all began. No words, no tears. Just two souls, returning to the silence that had once brought them together. Together at last, where no king could separate them, where no snow could bury them, where time held no power. And that's where their story rests. Not in history books, not in paintings, but in dreams, in the spaces between falling snowflakes, in gardens remembered only by the heart, in the hush of candlelight, in you. So if you ever find yourself walking through a winter field, and you feel the wind pause, and the snowflakes slow, maybe you're closer to her than you think. Maybe you'll feel her there. A queen who loved quietly and waited forever, until forever came. Anastasia was born under a silver moon. The snow had fallen endlessly the night she arrived. Some said she was a gift from the stars. Others whispered she was born of winter itself. She was small, pale, and very quiet. Even as a child, she barely cried. Not because she didn't feel, but because she felt too much. Her mother died when she was just 6. A fever, sudden and unstoppable. The palace mourned. The king, her father, grew colder. And little Anastasia learned that the world could vanish with just one quiet breath. After that, she stopped speaking for a while. The nurses tried. The tutors waited. But weeks passed, and the girl remained silent. She would sit beside the frozen fountain, watching her reflection in the ice, imagining it was her mother watching back. She whispered to the wind. Not words, just thoughts. She believed the snow could carry them. And maybe it did. She was raised in rules. A princess must smile. A princess must bow. A princess must not speak unless spoken to. And so Anastasia obeyed. But her heart wandered elsewhere. She read old books, stories of distant lands, of desert queens and forest kings, of star-crossed lovers and forgotten kingdoms. She dreamed of running. But where would a girl go whose world was made of ice? Years passed. The child grew into a young woman. Her hair darkened. Her eyes grew thoughtful. And though her voice returned, she still spoke rarely. She discovered music. A small piano in the east wing, dusty and forgotten. She taught herself how to play, not by reading, but by feeling. Each note was a memory. Each chord, a secret she couldn't say aloud. At night, the halls would fill with quiet melodies. No one dared stop her. It was the only time the palace felt alive. One winter morning, as frost painted lace along her window, she wrote in her diary, "I am not made of silence. I am made of unspoken songs." And yet, her life remained still. The king had plans. A marriage alliance. A future shaped by names, not hearts. He promised her to a foreign prince, one she had never met, one who spoke of duty more than love. She nodded when he told her. Did not cry, did not fight. But that night, she played a song on the piano that made even the candles tremble. There was a boy once, a stable hand, who gave her a flower. A simple thing. A blue bloom from the field beyond the walls. She kept it pressed in a book. But when the maids found it, they burned it. They told her a queen does not accept weeds from commoners. She said nothing, but for weeks after, she refused to wear anything blue. Her silence was not weakness. It was armor. A quiet so powerful, even thunder would stop to listen. No one truly knew her. They saw the gown, the posture, the polished words. But beneath it all was a girl, still sitting by the frozen fountain, waiting for a voice to answer her silence. She had friends, but not the kind who understood her. Ladies of the court who smiled too easily. Princes who spoke of riches and bloodlines. None of them ever asked, "Are you happy?" She wondered sometimes if anyone truly loved her, or if they only loved the idea of her. The perfect princess, the silent swan, the porcelain mask. She began to disappear inward, living more in dreams than in daylight. In her sleep, she wandered through the warm forests. She danced beneath cherry blossoms. She held hands with someone whose face she never saw. But she always remembered the feeling. Safe, soft, true. She wrote about him in her journal. "I see him only in dreams. But when he holds my hand, I wake with warmth in my chest, even if the snow has covered my world again." That dream stayed with her for years, until one day, in the coldest month of the coldest year, she stepped into the garden and found a single red flower growing from the frost. She knelt beside it, her breath shaking, and in that moment, she remembered the dream. She remembered the feeling. She smiled, not wide, not aloud, just enough for herself. And somewhere, deep within the silence she had lived in all her life, a door opened. She did not know yet that someone had entered, but she would know soon. The red flower stayed. Every morning, Anastasia would rise early, pull her cloak tightly around her shoulders, and walk alone through the garden frost, just to see if it was still there. And it always was. Bright, defiant, alive in a world that had forgotten how to feel. She never touched it. She only looked. And something inside her began to warm. It was not loud, this change. It was not a sudden bloom of joy, but more like fire beneath snow. A slow burn. She began to speak more, just a little. She asked the cook for fresh bread instead of the stale royal loaf. She told her maid to leave her hair down, not pinned. One day she even sang, alone in her room. Just a few soft notes. It startled her. She had forgotten what her voice sounded like when it wasn't wrapped in duty. At night, she still wrote in her journal. "Today I heard the wind speak to me. It did not use words, but I understood it anyway. That spring, the king fell ill, and though he recovered, he became more withdrawn, more reliant on his advisors, more interested in controlling the world than understanding it. Anastasia was left alone more often. And strangely, she didn't mind, because in the quiet, she was beginning to hear herself again. She started painting. Not like a trained court artist, but like a child with something to say. She painted her dreams, the faceless man, the blossom trees, a field with a single figure in gray. She didn't know why she painted gray. It felt natural, safe. She hung one of them near her bedside, not to show others, just to remind herself that there was still color inside her. One afternoon, she returned to the garden and found a piece of parchment lying by the red flower. It was a sketch, rough, charcoal, but clear. It was her, sitting beside the very flower she was looking at now. Her breath caught. She looked around. No footsteps, no figure, Just snow and silence. But she knew. Someone had seen her, drawn her, left this for her to find. And for the first time in a very long time, she laughed. Not loud, but real. She tucked the sketch into her sleeve and walked back to the palace, and with a new rhythm in her step. The next day there was another. A rose drawn in black and white, but shaded so delicately it seemed to glow. Each morning brought something new, a fountain, a sparrow, a quiet portrait of her from behind, hair loose, face turned away. No words, only images. But they spoke louder than voices. She began leaving things in return. A silk ribbon, a pressed petal, a note that read, "I do not know who you are, but I feel as though you've known me forever." She felt like a girl again, not the sad-eyed child, but the one who used to dream beneath the stars and believe that someone, somewhere, was made from the same silence as her. The court didn't notice, or pretend not to. Let her have her secrets, they said. The queen is strange but quiet. Let her speak to shadows, so long as she doesn't disrupt the crown. But she was not speaking to shadows. She was being seen. And in that seeing, she was slowly being reborn. One morning, the flower was gone. But in its place was a figure. Tall, gray coat, a satchel across his chest, charcoal on his fingers. He didn't bow, didn't speak. He just looked at her. And she smiled. Because somehow she knew. This was the man she had drawn long before he ever stood before her. And though no one spoke, the world around them grew quiet. As if everything, the snow, the palace, and the wind itself, was waiting to witness what came next. Would you like me to continue with segment 3 of 6 next, where their story truly begins from the first shared words to the soft spark of connection? We're right at the beginning of their love again, this time told deeper, softer, and more personal. They stood in the garden, and the snow falling like feathers between them. And for a long time, neither spoke. Anastasia looked at him, as if she were trying to remember a dream she had once forgotten. And in truth, that's what it felt like, as if he had stepped out of the pages of her journal. He held no title, wore no medal. He was just a man with quiet eyes and hands that had drawn her soul before he ever touched her hand. Finally he spoke. "I didn't mean to be seen." And she answered, "Then why did you leave your sketches where I could find them?" He smiled gently. "Because I hoped you would." She walked closer. "What's your name?" she asked. "Luca," he said. She didn't give hers. She didn't need to. He already knew. They didn't shake hands. Didn't bow. Just stood there. Two people surrounded by silence that somehow didn't feel empty anymore. She looked at the spot where the red flower used to be. Snow had covered it again, but the memory still glowed. "You drew me," she said. "I did," Luca replied, "because you looked like someone who needed to be remembered." She didn't know what to say. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not as a queen, not as a symbol, just as a person trying to stay warm in a cold world. He told her he was once a traveler, but had stayed in the kingdom when the roads froze over. He'd worked in the kitchens, in the stables, anywhere he could trade work for shelter. But at night, he drew, not for coin, not for praise. He drew because it made him feel alive. And when he saw her, standing alone in the garden, surrounded by frost and silence, he had felt something stir. "I saw you," he said. "Before you saw me." And I knew, even then, you weren't cold. You were just waiting. Anastasia felt something shift in her chest. Not dramatically, not loudly, just shift. They met again the next day, not by plan, by instinct. Two people drawn to the same quiet. They didn't speak much. He would draw. She would watch. And sometimes she would sit beside him and simply close her eyes to the sound of his pencil brushing across the page. One afternoon, she brought him tea. He didn't thank her. Instead, he looked into the steam rising from the cup and said, "This is the first warm thing anyone has given me in a long time." She understood. They began to share pieces of themselves. Not all at once, just fragments. She told him about the piano, about how music felt like speaking without being punished for it. He told her about his sister, who once believed every star was a story, and so he started drawing stars for her. Little ones, scattered across the corners of his sketches, a secret language just for them. She began looking for them. And when she found one, she would smile in that quiet way she did, small, soft, like a secret blooming. He asked her once why she didn't speak much at court. She answered, "Because I've learned that words only matter when they come from truth. And most people there speak from fear." Luca nodded. "Then let's never speak in fear." And from that day forward, they didn't. They spoke slowly. They listened deeply. They paused often, as if their time together was a thread too precious to pull tight. It was not love, not yet. But it was something more than friendship. It was recognition, a soul meeting another and saying, "I see you. I hear the silence you carry, and I understand it." One evening she asked him, "Why me?" And Luca replied, "Because I've seen hundreds of faces, but yours was the only one that looked like it was waiting to be known." That night she played the piano again, but this time not for herself. She left her chamber door open, just enough. And Luca, walking past, paused. He didn't enter. He just stood in the hall, listening. And she knew. Because when you love in silence, you learn to feel what others can't say. And they were both learning to say everything without a single word. Spring had not yet come. But the snow was softer now. And in the garden, the ground began to breathe again. Each day, Anastasia and Luca found themselves there, not always speaking, but always sharing space. He brought her sketches of the stars, drawings of things she told him she dreamed of. She brought him small notes, folded carefully, with thoughts too delicate for voice. "You feel like silence," she once wrote, "but not the kind that is empty. The kind that holds every answer I never knew how to ask." Sometimes he'd read her poetry, not his own. Old words from forgotten poets. Lines she had never heard, but somehow already understood. "You are not a storm," he whispered one day. "You are the stillness before it. The kind that makes the world listen." She smiled, not for him, but because she finally felt seen. There was no rush between them, no grand confessions, just gestures, moments, pauses filled with more meaning than entire conversations. One morning, as the frost began to thin across the marble steps, Luca handed her a sketch. It was her again. But this time she was laughing, head tilted back, eyes closed, wind catching her hair. She stared at it for a long time. "I don't laugh like that," she said. "Not yet," he replied. And that was the moment she realized he didn't just see her as she was, he saw her as she could be. And that is love in its purest form. They began to create a rhythm. He would leave sketches on her windowsill. She would press wildflowers between the pages of his notebook. He once brought her a stone, just a small, smooth one, with a crack running through the center. "It's broken," she said. He nodded. "But it still fits in your hand." That night she held it while she slept. She never told anyone about him. Not her ladies-in-waiting, not her guards, not even her reflection. Some things are too sacred for words, too soft to survive outside the heart. They never touched. Not yet. But one evening, as they sat beneath the bare tree branches, she reached out and brushed a snowflake from his sleeve. Just that. And yet, it felt like the whole world stopped. His breath caught, but he said nothing. Because love, when real, doesn't need to declare itself. It just is. She once asked him what he feared most. He thought for a moment and said, "Being forgotten by someone I loved." She touched his sketchbook gently. "Then I'll remember you forever." And he believed her. They spoke of nothing and everything. Of stars that disappeared behind clouds. Of songs that made her cry. Of the smell of old parchment. Of the first time he saw snow. One day he asked if she had ever been kissed. She looked away. "Not truly," she said. Not in a way that felt like more than duty. He nodded and didn't ask again. But later on, when she stood to leave, he said softly, "Then I hope the first one that matters is quiet and slow and chosen." She didn't answer. But her heart held onto those words like a thread she never wanted to untie. Days passed. The garden changed. The trees whispered differently. And the queen, who once loved in silence, began to listen for the sound of her own heart beating in time with someone else's. The snow had thinned, but not vanished. And the garden now carried the scent of something waiting to grow. Their visits had no schedule, no rules. But always, they found each other. Sometimes Luca would be sitting under the archway, his coat dusted with frost, a pencil between his fingers. Other times, Anastasia would arrive first, her hands hidden in her sleeves, pretending not to be waiting. But she always was, waiting for the soft sound of his footsteps. The quiet breath before he spoke. The pause in the air. That meant he had something to show her. One day he brought no sketch, no paper, no words, just himself. She noticed it immediately. "You didn't draw today?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Not with my hands," he said. Then he stepped aside, and behind him was a sculpture hidden beneath a linen cloth. He pulled it away. It was her, not standing, not posed like a queen, but sitting quietly, her face turned toward the sky. Peaceful, vulnerable, real. She stepped forward. "You remembered every detail." "I didn't remember," he said. "I saw it the whole time." Her throat tightened. "Why did you make this?" "Because I wanted to show you what you look like when you think no one is watching." She felt her heart press against her ribs, not painfully, but like it wanted to be closer to him than her body would allow. He looked nervous. "If it's too much, no," she whispered. "It's not." But something inside her felt afraid, not of him, but of what this might become. Because when silence gives way to love, it also opens the door to loss. They sat in the garden for hours that day. Neither spoke of the sculpture again. But the space between them was warmer, closer, almost trembling. The next day she left him a letter. I don't know if I believe in fate, but I believe in this, in us, in whatever we are becoming. And he left her one in return. If I loved you, not as a queen, but as a woman, would I be wrong? She read it 10 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it inside the cover of her journal. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay awake, watching the shadows stretch and retreat across her walls, listening to the echo of his words. Would I be wrong? She wanted to answer. But her whole life had been built on silence. And silence is hard to unlearn. When they met again, she didn't say anything at first. She simply walked up to him, took the pencil from his fingers, and wrote a single line on the page he had been sketching on. You would not be wrong, but you would be brave. He read it, then looked up. And for the first time, he reached for her hand. Not fast, not forceful, just a slow invitation. She gave it to him. Their fingers touched. And in that moment, the entire world became still. No kings, no courts, no snow, no rules. Just this. A hand in a hand. A promise without words. They stayed like that until the wind began to rise. She looked at him. This cannot be known. He nodded. Then let it live in silence. She smiled. Like us. Exactly like us. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer empty. No longer heavy with things left unsaid. Now it pulsed softly, like the hush between heartbeats. The kind of silence that held meaning. The kind that carried love. They met almost daily now, although never at the same time. Never by plan. Always by gravity. Sometimes he brought her drawings. Sometimes she brought him stories. And sometimes they simply sat side by side, saying nothing, because nothing needed to be said. One morning he placed a sketch in her hand and closed her fingers around it gently. She waited until he left before opening it. It was her again. But this time she was dancing. Eyes closed. Hair wild. Feet barely touching the ground. She had never danced in her life. Not like that. And yet, he saw her that way. Free. Unburdened. Alive. She pressed the paper to her chest and wept. Just a little. Because sometimes joy is too big to stay inside the heart. That night she wrote in her journal, I am falling in love, not with a man, but with the way I feel when I am near him. I am no longer lonely, even when I am alone. The seasons shifted. The garden changed again. The snow thinned into dew, and the fountain began to sing once more. But the palace remained the same, its coldness untouched, its rules unmoved. Rumors began to rise in hushed corners. Advisors whispered of the queen's solitude, of her absence from certain chambers, of a painter whose face no one could clearly remember. Anastasia felt the cold fingers of caution returning, the same chill that had once silenced her. She met Luca beneath the archway. We must be careful, she said. He nodded, but there was pain in his eyes. He knew. They both knew. This was a world where love did not belong to queens, where silence was a crown and speaking from the heart was treason. She leaned into him that night, not in passion, not in fear, but in quiet surrender. And for the first time, she let her forehead rest against his chest. Let his heartbeat become her lullaby. Stay with me, she whispered. I'll stay as long as the snow allows, he replied. She looked up. And what happens when it melts? He didn't answer, because some answers are too painful to speak aloud. In the days that followed, they were more careful, more distant in the eyes of others, but closer than ever in the way they moved, the way they looked, the way they breathed. She touched his hand in the dark hallway when no one was watching. He left a painting in her chamber with no name, no note, just a window opening toward a blue sky. And still, they never said the words, not because they didn't feel them, but because saying them might mean breaking the spell. But love has a way of echoing louder the longer it goes unspoken. And so, in the hush between days, in the fold of her pillow, and in the charcoal on his fingers, they told each other everything. Until one morning, she woke to a palace wrapped in silence again. But not the safe kind, the fearful kind, the kind that comes just before something ends. She looked out her window. The garden was still. The red flower was gone. And Luca was not there. She waited and waited. And the quiet stretched long and sharp. That night, she did not cry. She sat at her piano and played. For him. For herself. For the silence that had always been hers. And when the final note faded, she whispered, "I remember you. And I will. Always. The snow may fall again. But this time, it knows her name. And she knows love. Even if it must live in silence." Last time, we left Anastasia on the edge of something breaking. Not her heart, that had broken long ago, but the part of her that still believed love could live safely in silence. This is what came next. The garden was empty. She waited for Luca day after day. Morning frost melted into afternoon sun, and still nothing. No sketches. No notes. No shadow beneath the archway. He was gone. And no one could tell her why. She asked softly, without naming him, "Have there been any visitors missing? Any travelers who left suddenly?" The servants avoided her eyes. The guards said nothing. The walls of the palace had closed their mouths, but the silence felt different now. It wasn't gentle. It was cruel. She walked to the garden alone, not to look for him anymore, but to remember. She stood where they last sat, kneeling slowly beside the stone bench. She touched the cold marble, as if it still held his warmth. She whispered his name, just once, into the wind. And when it didn't echo back or die, she knew. He had been taken. By fear. By power. By the same invisible hand that had always shaped her life. She wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger's loud. And she had no strength for loudness anymore. She returned to her room, lit a candle, and opened her journal. Today I lost something that never belonged to the world. Only to me. She didn't cry. She sat at the piano and let the keys carry her sorrow instead. The melody was low, slow, like snowfall in a graveyard. Outside her door, no one dared interrupt, because when a queen mourns in music, the entire kingdom listens in silence. The days blurred. She returned to her royal duties, attended court, nodded at speeches, signed papers. But something had changed. She no longer tried to please them. She no longer tilted her head like a doll. She watched and waited and listened. Because power had taken something from her. And now she would learn how to take something back. Not with war, not with rage, but with memory. She began to change the way she ruled. Quietly. Without fanfare. She canceled forced marriages for noble girls, reopened the palace library to the common people, began asking the names of the servants instead of calling them by their titles. At first, the court called it softness, then rebellion, then madness. But it was none of those. It was love, transformed. It was grief and rewritten. It was a queen learning how to speak in ways her silence never allowed. She returned to the garden and planted a red flower, one like the one he had once left. Every morning she watered it herself, and every night she played the piano with one candle lit beside her. The flame flickered like a heartbeat, small, steady, refusing to go out. She began writing letters, not to him, but to herself. Dear girl who once waited for a shadow in the snow, you are not alone. He may be gone, but the way you loved him still lives in you, and that no king can take. In a palace built on silence, a whisper had begun to grow, and soon that whisper would become legend. The palace hadn't changed. Its walls were still stone. Its halls still echoed with footsteps, measured, rehearsed, and cautious. But Anastasia had changed, and though she wore the same gowns, spoke in the same tone, moved with the same grace, the silence around her was no longer hers. She started asking questions, not directly, not foolishly, but carefully, quietly. She began with the servant who brought her tea, a girl with down-turned eyes and hands that trembled. Has anyone been reassigned from the garden recently? The girl hesitated, then shook her head. Not reassigned. Just dismissed. Dismissed? For what? The girl didn't answer, but her silence was enough. Anastasia nodded and thanked her softly. Then she lit a candle on her windowsill that night and watched it flicker like memory. She asked her steward about supplies brought in from the village. Have you noticed any missing documentation? Names missing from the books? He blinked. Your Majesty, why would you ask? Because I'm tired of only knowing what others want me to know. He nodded, but his eyes didn't meet hers. The walls were watching. That night, she walked the corridors past midnight when the palace slept. She passed the art wing, where old portraits hung in silence. She paused beside one and looked into the eyes of a queen long dead. Did they silence your heart too? She thought she saw the candlelight flicker in reply. Down the west corridor, she found a door, one she hadn't opened in years. It led to the old records room. Dust clung to the air. The scent of parchment and ink was heavy. She opened the registry. Servants, visitors, guards. And there, his name. Luca listed as a hired sketcher for winter decor. Seasonal appointment. No formal dismissal. No exit record. No signature. Gone without trace. She touched the ink with her fingertips. He had existed. He had lived here. Loved here. And now the palace wanted to erase that. She stood there for a long time, listening to the echo of her own breathing. Then she whispered, I remember, and I will not forget. In the following days, she began writing again. Not in her journal, but in letters to the court. She began quietly changing policies, granting protection to undocumented workers, requesting names be kept and not discarded. She visited the kitchens, the stables, the art halls. Everywhere he had once stood, she stood too, not to find him, but to leave behind something of her own, a look, a word, a memory. They say ghosts haunt the places they loved. But Anastasia, she became a living memory. A quiet echo walking through the halls, carrying a love they tried to erase. And slowly, others began to notice. A maid left a sketch on her table, not signed, just a rose drawn in charcoal. A gardener whispered. He was kind. That's all I remember. But I remember a child from the servant quarters recited a poem Luca had once shared, not knowing where it came from. And Anastasia smiled, because he was still here, in pieces, in shadows, in the stories passed in whispers. She returned to the garden one evening. The red flower was still there, touched by frost, but not dead. She sat beside it, not to mourn, but to promise. They took your voice, but mine still remains, and I will use it to keep you alive. Snow began falling again, soft, slow, but no longer heavy. And beneath the throne, a whisper became a vow. The court still believed Anastasia was grieving in silence, and she was. But her silence had changed. It was not made of sadness anymore. It was made of strategy, of patience, of love reforged into strength. She didn't raise her voice. She raised questions. Why were certain artists restricted from the palace halls? Why were workers removed without notice? Why were the names of the poor missing from royal records? The council grew uncomfortable. They smiled tightly, dismissed her questions with polite phrases. Your Majesty, this is not your concern. It's not proper for a queen to involve herself with the lower ranks. Let the ministers manage such matters. But she didn't stop asking. She just stopped asking out loud. Instead, she wrote. She began gathering names. Servants who had vanished. Artists, painters, stone carvers, people like Luca. She kept their names in a locked drawer beneath her desk. But each one, she remembered. Because if love taught her anything, it was this. To forget someone is to let the world erase them. And she refused. One morning, she stood before the grand mirror in her chamber. She no longer saw a girl in frost. She no longer saw a queen in chains. She saw a woman made of memory. A woman who once knelt by a frozen flower and learned to feel again. She walked through the halls differently now. Straighter, calmer. Not with defiance, but with a stillness that made people stop and wonder. She spoke to everyone, not just nobles. She asked names, stories, small things. And slowly, the palace began to whisper differently. They called her the listening queen, the soft crown, the silent fire. But the ministers, they were watching. She knew. So she planned quietly, carefully. She called for a seasonal art exhibit, a public one. She said the kingdom had forgotten beauty and needed to remember. Invite everyone, she said, from castle to cottage. Let no name be too small. They agreed reluctantly. A queen requesting such a thing was odd, but not dangerous. Not yet. She hired painters from the outer provinces, sculptors who had once been cast aside. Even children with colored chalk were invited to display their dreams. And in the center of the exhibit, beneath the palace ceiling, she left a pedestal empty, with a sign that read, "To the one they silenced, but not forgotten." No one asked who it meant. No one dared. But when the people came, when they saw the flowers she placed beside it, the charcoal roses on the frame, the drawings of faceless dancers, they knew. She never said his name aloud. She didn't have to. He was everywhere, in the way she moved, in the art that lined the halls, in the music she played each night, Luca had been erased from the records. But Anastasia had written him back into the soul of the kingdom. And now, they whispered his name again. Not as a servant and not as a criminal, but as a love that even silence could not bury. She stood on the balcony after the exhibit ended. The snow was soft again. The stars scattered like ashes. She looked up and said softly, "They think I've forgotten. But I remember. I always will." And far below, in the garden beneath her feet, a red flower bloomed through the frost. Change doesn't come with noise. Not in places built by kings. It comes in the small things. A servant allowed to keep a sketch. A cook permitted to season the soup with her own recipe. A child in the lower halls, given paper and chalk and told, "Draw what you see." Anastasia saw it all. She didn't lead with commands. She led by remembering. She spoke less at court now. But when she did, the room always fell silent. Because even the coldest men could feel what she carried. It wasn't power. It wasn't grief. It was truth. The kind that lingers in the air, and like music after the notes have ended. One night she hosted a gathering under the guise of a winter reading. She invited poets, mothers, workers, people whose stories never reached the throne. They read by candlelight, voices trembling, but strong. One woman stood, and spoke of her brother, a sculptor who vanished after leaving behind a statue that no one claimed. Anastasia closed her eyes. She didn't speak, but her silence was a vow. "They are starting to remember," she wrote later. "Not just him, but themselves." And that, more than any crown, was what frightened the ministers most. They had ruled with silence, with forgetting, with fear. But now the people were listening again, feeling again, dreaming again. And the queen was not theirs anymore. The council called a meeting in secret. She was not invited, but she knew. She saw it in their eyes the next morning, the way they avoided her, the way their voices were too even, too careful. She knew the storm was coming, but she did not run. She returned to the garden, sat beside the red flower, and wrote a letter, not to Luca, but to the world. "If I vanish, let it be known. I lived fully. I loved fiercely. And I remembered those the world tried to erase." She sealed it, placed it in a hidden drawer only one trusted maid knew of. Then she lit a candle and played the piano. Not sadly, not in mourning, but with purpose. A melody that rose like dawn and wept like rain. A song for the silenced, a song for him, a song for herself. Her fingers shook, but she did not stop. Because when the world tries to silence you, the greatest rebellion is to sing. Outside the palace walls, the people began telling her story. They didn't use her name. They called her the Remembering Queen, the one who ruled without a sword, the one who loved a ghost, the one who planted a flower in the snow and never let it die. The snow returned, not heavy, not angry, just soft enough to remind her that the season was circling again. It had been nearly a year since the day she lost him. And yet, every time she walked through the garden, he was there. Not in body, not in voice, but in the shape of silence that had once been love. She sat at her window, watching the snow fall. A guard stood outside her door now, a quiet one, polite, but always there. They said it was for her safety, but she knew better. They feared what she was becoming. She had not raised her voice. She had not broken their rules. And yet, she had made them tremble. Because in a world built on forgetting, the one who remembers is dangerous. They called another meeting. This time, she demanded to attend. You no longer seek counsel, they told her. You seek to change the kingdom. And what if I do, she answered. Has silence served us? Has fear made us noble? One minister stood. He was older, gray-haired, his voice like stone. You speak of memory, but memory is not law. Then let it be, she said, because law without memory is nothing but a chain. The room fell quiet. That night, she did not return to her chambers. She went to the East Wing, out, a place unused, forgotten. There she found a locked room, filled with old portraits, tapestries, dust-covered records. Among them, a sketch, faded, framed in broken glass. It was of her, years ago, standing by the garden fountain, eyes down, hands folded. She turned it over. No signature, just a single word, etched faintly in charcoal. Yours. She held it to her chest and breathed in deeply. They could take his name. They could steal the pages, but they would never erase the way he saw her. Never. She hung the portrait in her chamber, not in hiding, but above the fireplace, where all would see. They removed it by morning. She replaced it by night, and again, until the servants stopped taking it down. Let them be afraid, she wrote in her journal, because I am not. She began appearing in public more often, not in jewels, not in gold, but in simple gowns, like the one she wore the day she met him. She walked through the village and asked the children what they dreamed of. She visited the sculptors and placed coins in their empty bowls. Every act of kindness was a rebellion. Every memory she kept alive was a revolution. They called her dangerous in whispers, called her distracted, emotional, foolish. But behind those words was fear. And behind her stillness was a storm. The council met again, this time without telling her. But she felt it, in the shift of the guards, in the way the servants moved quicker, in the sudden silence that grew sharper with every step. She knew something was coming, but she did not run. She walked to the garden and sat beside the flower he once gave her. It was still blooming, even through the frost, still red, still whole. She reached out and touched a single petal. I am ready, she whispered, for whatever comes. And the wind, soft and cold, carried her voice to the corners of the kingdom. The palace air was colder now, not from winter, but from fear. Not hers, theirs. Anastasia could feel it in the way they looked at her, not with pity anymore, not with indulgence, but with unease. They didn't know what to do with a queen who didn't need their approval, because she had found something stronger than fear. She had found her memory, and she carried it like armor. That morning, the council summoned her, but not to advise, to warn. They stood in a circle, their words polished, Nunzian and sharp. You are planting unrest. You are encouraging disobedience. You are remembering things that were meant to be forgotten. She said nothing. They pressed further. If you continue, we will be forced to act. She raised her eyes. I have already acted, and you are too late. They stared at her, confused, angry, uncertain, because they could not see what she had done. But it was already done. Across the villages, some people told her story. They drew pictures of her with wildflowers in her hands. They whispered Luca's name as if it were sacred. They wrote poems and folded them into stones and placed them in the gardens. One by one, the forgotten were being remembered. The council tried to silence her, limit her public appearances, reduce her power. But they had forgotten something. Anastasia was not power. She was love. And love, once awakened, cannot be caged. She returned to the East Wing, sat at the old piano, and played one final time. The melody was simple. The kind Luca might have hummed. The kind she once imagined they'd dance to someday if the world had been kinder. The halls didn't echo. The servants didn't speak. But they listened. Because music does what words cannot. When she finished, she rose, walked to the balcony, and looked out over the kingdom. The sky was gray, the snow soft. But the world felt different now. Not healed, but no longer hollow. And somewhere in the garden below, beneath the ice, the red flower waited for spring. She whispered, "They tried to erase you, but you live in me, and I live in them." In the years that followed, her name faded from politics. She stepped away from court, lived quietly, wrote letters, tended to the garden. But the people remembered. They carved her story into stone, sang it as lullabies, told their children. Once there was a queen who loved in silence and turned that silence into a song we still hear in the snow. The year was different now. The palace had crumbled, its halls filled with dust, its windows broken by wind and memory. But the garden still bloomed, not wild, not full, just enough to whisper that something once lived here and never quite died. A girl named Elira stood at the edge of it. She was 16, curious, quiet, drawn to forgotten things. She had come with her grandfather, a historian, tasked with mapping the ruins of the old palace. He told her not to wander too far, but the garden called to her. And so, like all good stories begin, she followed a feeling, through brittle branches, over cracked stones, until she saw something red breaking through the snow. A flower, just one, still blooming, still whole. She knelt beside it, and there, half buried beneath the frost, she found it. A small wooden box, old, weather-worn, wrapped in twine, and sealed with a broken wax stamp. Her fingers shook as she opened it. Inside were letters. Dozens. All written in the same hand. Elegant, strong, but soft. She picked the first one and began to read. To the one I loved in silence. I don't know where they took you, but I speak to you each night, through music, through memory, through the petals that refuse to fall. Elira froze. She didn't know who wrote it, but something inside her stirred. She read the second. I saw your face in a dream. You hadn't aged. You smiled at me, like no time had passed, and I wept when I woke. And another. They tell me to move on, but you are not the place I left. You are a part of me, still walking. She clutched the letters, and as tears filled her eyes. She didn't know why she was crying, only that she felt like she had opened a door, not just to the past, but to someone's heart that had waited a very long time to be heard. That night she returned to the old guest house, where she and her grandfather were staying, and when he had fallen asleep, she sat by candlelight and read every single letter, each one a thread weaving a story of love, loss, resistance, and hope. By morning, she knew the writer's name, Anastasia, the remembering queen. But this was not the queen from the history books. This was a woman, a soul, a voice that had never been allowed to speak freely in her time. Until now, Elira made a choice. She would not keep the letters hidden. She would not tuck them back beneath the soil. She would give them breath again. Because love like that deserved to be heard, even if it had been written in silence. In the ruins of an old world, a new voice began to rise. And the letters she left behind of this were about to change everything. Elira sat at the wooden desk. The candle flickered beside her. Outside the window, snow kissed the earth and like a memory returning. She unfolded the first letter with care. It wasn't addressed to anyone by name, but it didn't need to be. To the one I watched walk away without a sound, I want you to know that the silence you left me in grew into something I could carry. Elira read the words softly, as if afraid they would vanish if spoken too loud. You gave me no goodbye, but that was not your choice. The world pulled you from me, and I stayed because someone had to remember. She placed the letter down. Her fingers trembled. There was so much love here, so much loss, so much left unsaid. She opened another. They still expect me to rule as if I have not been broken, but I am not broken. I am cracked, and through the cracks, your light still shines. Elira felt her chest tighten. This was not just history. This was a heart, still beating through ink. She reached for a third. Every time I walk past the fountain, I remember your smile. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real, in a world that wanted me to be anything but. That line echoed through her. It was like the queen was still alive, not in body, but in voice, in truth. Elira whispered to the air, "What were you really like?" And as if the letters could hear her, and the next one seemed to answer, I was raised to be gentle, to smile with grace, to never let my voice be louder than the room. But you saw me. You heard me. You listened. When I didn't know how to speak. She turned the page. They said I was foolish to love you, that a queen must not fall for a shadow. But if loving you was foolish, then I wish to remain a fool. Forever? Elira's eyes welled with tears. This wasn't a fairy tale. This wasn't a myth. It was a woman fighting to keep love alive in a world that made her bury it. And now, through Elira, that love was breathing again. She lit a second candle, then a third. And surrounded by warm light and falling snow, she began reading the letters, out loud, one by one. With each word, she felt Anastasia grow clearer, not just as a queen, but as a soul, a girl, a woman, who once knelt in a winter garden and dared to feel something real. There were more letters to read, many more, and each one was a thread leading back to a love that history tried to forget, but never truly could. Elira found a longer letter, folded more carefully than the rest. The paper was older, the ink lighter, as if it had been written with hands that shook. She unfolded it slowly, held it to the candlelight, and began to read. This was not the Queen's voice from before. This letter was different, not written in strength, but in surrender. I almost left the world that night. Elira's breath caught. The sentence stood alone, bare, unmoving. I walked to the balcony and looked down at the garden we once shared. The flower was there, still blooming, but I wasn't. Not really. Everything in me was quiet, not peaceful, just numb. The kind of silence that no music can reach. She paused. Her hands felt cold, but she kept reading. I thought about how easy it would be to let go, to disappear into the snow like you did. No one would stop me. No one would understand. They would say I was tired, or troubled, or tragic. But the truth is, I just missed your voice, the way you saw me. I was so tired of being seen as a symbol, a crown, a woman made of stone. Alira's eyes filled with tears. The candle flame flickered softly, like it too was listening. I don't remember how long I stood there. Minutes, maybe hours. But then I heard something. It wasn't your voice. Not really. Just a memory of it. You once told me, that people like us carry light in places the world forgets to look. You said I had a flame that didn't burn. It warmed. I stepped back from the edge, not because I wanted to live, but because you believed I should. I went to the piano. I played until my hands ached, until I remembered. I was still here. Alira wiped her cheek. This was no longer a letter. It was a heartbeat on paper. I don't write this for anyone to find. But if someone does, if one day you're reading these words, please remember this. You don't have to roar to survive. You don't have to be brave every day. Sometimes just breathing is enough. Sometimes just remembering is everything. Alira folded the letter gently. The room was silent, but she didn't feel alone. She placed the letter beside her heart, closed her eyes, and whispered, I remember. Some love stories aren't meant to end. They live on, in letters, in hearts, in quiet girls reading by candlelight, centuries later. The next morning, Alira held the letters close to her chest as she stepped into the cold. Her grandfather was sketching the ruins. She walked past him quietly and returned to the garden, where the single red flower still stood. She knelt beside it, just like the queen once had. The snow around her was soft, the air hushed, and for the first time, she spoke aloud to someone she could not see. I don't know why you chose to hide them here, but I'm glad you did, because I found you. Not the queen they teach us about, but the real you, the one who loved, who hurt, who stayed. And I won't keep your voice quiet anymore. That afternoon, Alira returned to the village. There was a small library, dusty, quiet, barely visited. She approached the librarian, an old woman with soft eyes and hands that knew the touch of time. I found these, Alira said. They belong to a queen who was never allowed to be heard. Can I read them here? So others can listen too? The woman nodded, as if she had been waiting for this moment all her life. So Alira sat by the window, lit a candle, opened the first letter, and began to read. At first, no one noticed. The library stayed silent. Chairs remained empty. But by the second day, a child came and sat nearby. By the third, a young man, then a teacher, then a mother. Soon the chairs began to fill. No one spoke. They only listened, because the voice of a forgotten queen was stronger than they had imagined. Each letter brought more people. Some cried quietly. Some closed their eyes. Some held hands without saying why. But all of them, were remembering something they never knew they had lost. Elira didn't read like a performer. She read like a keeper of something sacred. One night, as snow fell outside the window, she read the letter where Anastasia wrote, "I do not know if I will be remembered. But if someone ever feels my words, even for a moment, then I will have lived twice." When she looked up, no one moved. Not even the librarian. They all just breathed together. And outside, in the night, the wind carried Anastasia's name through streets that had once forgotten her. "The remembering queen," they whispered. And for the first time, it wasn't just a title. It was a truth. It was a home for every soul that had ever loved in silence and waited to be seen. Elira didn't stop. She read every day. And the letters became more than words. They became warmth. They became history, rewritten by heart. Word travels, not in headlines, but in whispers. And the whispers had reached the capital. A girl was reading letters. Old ones. From the ruins of the Winter Palace. A girl was telling a story that had been hidden for generations. A girl was naming a queen, not for her crown, but for her heart. Elira didn't know how far it had spread. She didn't mean for it to. She was only reading. She was only remembering. But sometimes, remembering is enough to shake the ground. One evening, as she lit the candle in the library, two men entered quietly. They wore gray coats, gold pins at their collars, archivists, from the Royal Historical Bureau. They said nothing. They sat in the back and listened. Elira's voice didn't falter. She opened a letter Anastasia had written during her final days in the palace. "I have stopped asking to be heard. Now I only speak for those who still cannot. If history forgets me, so be it. But let it never forget them." After reading, the archivist approached her. "Where did you find these?" She paused, then said, "In the garden," the place where she remembered him. They asked to take the letters, to store them, to protect them. But Elira shook her head. Protect them from whom? They hesitated. From misinterpretation, from misuse, from the public. But the public is who she wrote them for. "You don't understand," one of them said. "If these letters are real, they rewrite what we know about her reign. They challenge the official archives." Elira looked them in the eyes. "Then maybe your archives need to be rewritten." That night, she didn't sleep. She stood by the garden again. The red flower still stood, a little frost-bitten, but proud. She whispered into the cold, "They want to hide you again." And though no voice answered, she felt it, a stillness in the air that told her this was her choice now. To let the letters be stored, cataloged, controlled, or to keep reading until the whole world heard the story. She returned to the library with her answer. She placed a sign by the door. "These are the letters of Queen Anastasia. She loved. She lost. She lived. You may listen. You may cry. But above all, remember, more people came. Not just from the village, from cities, from universities, from far-off places, where winter felt like a different kind of silence. And still, Elira read. In a world that once erased what didn't serve its story, a young girl had chosen to tell the one they tried to forget. Not with force, not with protest, but with voice. And that was enough. Elira stood in the middle of the library. There were no more empty chairs, no more silence. Only the sound of hearts leaning forward to listen. She held the final letter in her hands. It felt different, heavier. Not because of weight, but because of what he carried. She opened it slowly and read. To the one who finds this, I do not know your name. I do not know your face. But if you are holding my words, then you too are someone who believes that love never truly dies. I once loved a man whose name was taken from the books, whose art was erased from the walls, whose voice was silenced, so mine could remain untouched. But I remembered him, in secret, in sorrow, in strength. And now, you have remembered me. Elira paused, tears slipping down her cheek. She kept reading. Perhaps you're like me, a dreamer, a listener, someone who finds beauty in the quiet. If so, then I want you to know this. You are not weak for feeling deeply. You're not alone for loving someone. The world cannot understand. You are part of a lineage of hearts that beat quietly, but fiercely. So light a candle for me, not in mourning, but in thanks, because through you I live again. Elira closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." That night, the villagers walked to the library, carrying candles in their hands. They placed them by the windows, by the doors, by the path where snow still fell. Dozens of tiny flames, like stars on earth, all flickering for a queen they never knew, but somehow remembered. And above them, through the frost-stained glass, Elira read one final line. Love never ends. It only changes form. Sometimes it becomes music. Sometimes it becomes memory. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it becomes you. The next morning, the red flower in the palace garden was no longer alone. All around it, new petals had broken through the snow, crimson, soft and full. The garden had awakened. In Anastasia's story, Oin was now rooted forever. His name was Milo. He was 21. Quiet, thoughtful, always covered in charcoal dust. People said he was born with paint under his fingernails. He didn't speak much, but his art did. Milo lived above a bookstore in a rainy little city. His walls were covered in sketches. Eyes. Snow. A woman's silhouette, repeated over and over, though he didn't know her name. He'd never met her. Never seen her in life. But he dreamed of her. Always the same, standing in snow, wearing red, holding a flower. She never moved. She never spoke. She only looked at him, like she had been waiting. Every time he woke up, his hands trembled. He picked up his brush and painted her face from memory. Again, and again, and again. Until one day, his mentor came to visit. An old artist named Soren, who taught Milo how to see, not just with his eyes, but with his soul. Soren looked at the wall and froze. "Where did you see her?" Milo shrugged. "She comes to me in dreams." Soren stepped closer, tracing the paint with his wrinkled hand. "That's not a dream. That's a memory." Milo laughed gently. "That's impossible. She feels like someone I lost, but I don't even know her name." Soren looked at him for a long, long moment, then said, "There's something you need to see." They drove together through winding roads until the city faded and snow began to fall. Soren said nothing. They reached a village, small and old. Past it stood the ruins of a palace, half buried in frost and ivy. Milo stepped out of the car and stopped. He had seen this before. in dreams, in sketches, in feelings he couldn't explain. The garden, the fountain, the shape of the broken stone path. All of it. He walked forward, like he had always belonged here. At the center, he saw the statue. A woman with wind in her hair, eyes closed, a flower in her hand. The same one he painted, again and again. Soren placed a hand on his shoulder. Her name was Anastasia. She was a queen, long forgotten. But she loved a man who carved stone the way you paint dreams. And that man disappeared because he loved her. Milo felt the wind move through him like a memory returning. Do you know his name? Soren nodded. Luca. Milo stepped closer to the statue, and suddenly he couldn't breathe. Not from fear, but recognition. He had never known that name, but his hands had, because he carried his blood. Luca was your ancestor. Milo stood in the snow as the past unfolded around him. Not in words, not in books, but in the tremble of his fingers and the whisper of a woman in red who had waited 100 years to be painted again. The wind followed Milo all the way back to the city. Not sharp, not cold, just present, like a voice breathing softly behind him. He didn't speak during the drive. Didn't sleep that night. He just stared at the statue in his mind, and the name he somehow always knew without ever hearing. Luca, his blood, his shadow, his gift. He stood before the canvas in his studio and picked up the brush like it was calling to him. But this time, he didn't paint from memory. He painted from something deeper. Soren returned the next day with a box. Inside were copies of the letters Elira had read to the world years ago. They were preserved carefully, handled with reverence. Milo opened the first one. To the one I watched, walk away without a sound. The words curled around his heart like soft smoke. By the third line, his hand moved. He began to paint. Not her face this time, but her eyes. Not cold, not royal, alive, tired, glowing with the ache of love remembered. He read another. They said I was foolish to love you. Another stroke. Red around her. Not the red of blood. The red of something blooming, even in frost. He lost track of time. He forgot to eat. Forgot the city. Forgot himself. He only painted. And read. And painted again. His apartment filled with sketches. Of hands almost touching. Of snow swirling around stone steps. Of a man with his back turned, but his heart still there. And always, always the woman. Anastasia. She became more real with every letter. Because the more he read, the more he remembered things he had never lived. A piano under candlelight. A breath held in a hallway. A promise never spoken, but always felt. One night, he read this line. You once told me, I carry warmth in places the world has forgotten to feel. He whispered out loud, did I? And for a moment, he felt a warmth in the room, as if someone had just left it. He placed the newest canvas by the window. It wasn't perfect, but it was true. And truth, he was beginning to learn, was all she ever wanted. The next day, Soren brought a visitor. A woman with dark hair and quiet steps. This is Elira, he said. She's the one who found the letters. Milo's heart skipped. She looked at the painting, and said only 2 words. You saw her. Milo nodded. Not with my eyes. With something older. They sat in silence, and it wasn't awkward. It was full, like the space between notes in a song. And Milo knew he wasn't just painting for himself anymore. He was completing a story that had waited a century to be finished. Not for fame, not for history books, but for her. Milo didn't mean to cause a stir. He was just painting, just remembering. But the world has a way of noticing when truth slips back in through beauty. It began simply. Elira posted one of his paintings online. The woman in red. The snow. The sadness and the strength in her face. She wrote only one sentence beneath it. She was never forgotten. She was only waiting. The image spread like wind. Quietly but quickly. People started sharing it. Asking who she was. Where the painting came from. Why it felt like a memory they couldn't place. Milo didn't answer. He just painted more. He painted Luca next. Not with certainty, but with instinct. A man with rough hands and eyes full of softness. A man who carved beauty in a world that punished it. And behind him, always, the shadow of the woman he loved. More letters. More strokes. More truth rising. Soon a gallery reached out. Then a journalist. Then someone from the Royal Archives. Milo ignored most of them. But Elira, she sat beside him, night after night, helping him sort through the letters as he painted each one into light. They weren't just art. They were echoes, made visible. But not everyone liked the sound. One cold evening, a letter came. Formal. Sealed with the crest of the Bureau of Heritage. It read, "We request the removal of all associated works tied to the disputed account of Queen Anastasia's personal life. The restoration of official records must take precedence over artistic interpretations." Milo stared at the page. Elira's voice was calm. "This is what they do," she said. "They call truth disputed. When it doesn't fit their version of silence." Milo placed the letter aside and kept painting. He painted her hands, delicate, strong, stretched forward, as if reaching for something just out of reach. He painted the palace ruins, not broken, but alive, with flowers rising from stone. He painted the moment. Anastasia turned away from the balcony edge and walked back inside because she chose to live, even when the world gave her no reason. And he signed each canvas with only one symbol, L, not for Luca, not for himself, but for the love that refused to die. Soon people weren't just looking, they were remembering. They wrote letters of their own, poems, stories, songs. One girl left a sketch at the palace gate. Another lit a candle in her window every night at dusk. They didn't know Anastasia, but somehow they did. And Milo understood something then. He wasn't the end of her story. He was her beginning again. The air was still, as Milo and Elira walked the garden path again. The snow had softened everything. Each step made a hush, as if even the earth didn't want to interrupt. Milo carried a sketchbook. Elira a small oil lantern. The flame inside it was steady, like her. The red flower still bloomed at the center. The same one. Always the same. Elira knelt beside it and brushed away the snow. Her hand froze. There was something there. Not a letter. Not a box. A stone. Flat. Small. Carved. She lifted it gently. Beneath it, a shallow depression in the soil. Not natural. Deliberate. They dug slowly, carefully. And then, a second box. Older than the first. Wood worn nearly smooth. Elira opened it with trembling hands. Inside were two things: a folded piece of fabric and a final letter. She held the fabric up. It was red, frayed at the edges. The sleeve of a gown. Milo's breath caught. The same color she wore in every dream, in every painting. She was real. He reached for the letter. This one was addressed, not to the one I loved or to the one who finds me, but simply to the artist. He opened it. You do not know me, but you've carried my soul in your hands for longer than I dared hope. If you're reading this, then the world finally listened. And you, whoever you are, have given me back my voice. The world will always try to forget what doesn't serve it. But love is not for the world. Love is for the ones who carry it quietly, faithfully, into the dark, and paint it back into the light. You are my light. You are the echo of his hands, his eyes, his tenderness. And you were never dreaming. You were remembering. Milo couldn't speak. He only stared at the words, feeling them burn into his chest, like warmth after winter. Elira whispered. She knew someone would come. He nodded slowly. She knew I would. That evening, Milo painted under the stars. No photos. No models. No music. Only memory. He painted Anastasia one final time. But not as a queen. Not even as a woman waiting. He painted her laughing. Head tilted back. Hair wild in the wind. Alive. Free. And behind her, not a throne. Not a palace. But a garden. In bloom. They left the letter in the fabric. In the archives. Not locked away. Displayed. For everyone. And at the bottom of the glass case, one sentence was written. She loved deeply. She remembered bravely. And now she is remembered. The gallery was silent before it opened. Milo stood in the center of the room, surrounded by frames that held not just paint, but memory. He had spent weeks preparing. Every canvas chosen with care. Every detail purposeful. This was not about fame. This was about return. The return of a voice, of a woman, of a love that never left. He didn't invite critics, didn't post about it, but somehow word spread. On opening night, the gallery was full. Elira stood by the entrance, welcoming strangers who didn't know what they were walking into. And one by one, they stepped inside and saw her. Anastasia. Not in crowns, not in gowns, but in moments, holding a letter in candlelight, reaching through snow, smiling beside a man whose face mirrored Milo's own. There was no plaque, no long description, only small lines beneath each painting, lines pulled straight from the letters. You don't have to be brave every day. Sometimes just breathing is enough. Another said, if they erase us, let us leave behind flowers. And another, you are the echo of a love they buried, and you have brought it back to bloom. People didn't rush. They moved slowly. Some touched the glass, not to smudge it, but to feel closer. An older woman whispered, I feel like she's someone I lost. A boy sat on the floor, quietly sketching what he saw. A teacher brought her students and read each quote aloud like scripture. And all the while, Milo stood back. He didn't need to speak. His art already had. At the very end of the room hung the final piece. Anastasia in red, eyes open, standing in the garden, surrounded by blooming, fire-colored flowers. And behind her, Luca, not holding her, not watching her, walking beside her, Finally, a plaque beside this one held no quote, only a date. The day the statue was found. The day Milo opened the final letter. And one word: home. After the gallery closed, long after the visitors had gone, Milo stood alone before that final painting. Elira joined him. Neither said anything, until Milo finally whispered, "Do you think she sees it?" Elira smiled. "She doesn't need to see it. She is it." He nodded, and for the first time, he felt still, not restless, not haunted, just full, like something had completed its circle, like she had made it home. The train moved slowly through the frost. Milo sat by the window, watching the white fields blur by, his sketchbook closed on his lap. This was not a journey for answers. This was a goodbye, a thank you, a whisper, back into the place that had whispered to him so many times before. The palace ruins waited under soft snowfall. Familiar now, not haunted, just still. He walked the path alone. No fanfare, no words. The red flower still bloomed, even now, even always. He knelt beside it. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a letter of his own. He had written it the night after the gallery opened. It wasn't long. It said, "You were never lost. You were simply waiting for someone who could remember. Thank you for the voice, for the ache, for the love. I carried it all, and I will leave it here for someone else to find." He folded the page, and tucked it into the earth beside the flower. And then from his bag, he brought a small canvas. Not of Anastasia, not of Luca, not even of the garden. It was blank, pure white, a symbol of stories still to come. He placed it gently into the hollow where the first letters were found years ago, and above it, carved into the old stone with a soft, simple tool, he etched just 2 words: "Keep remembering." He stood, brushed snow from his coat, and walked back down the path and with lighter steps. Behind him, the garden didn't fade. It seemed to glow as the snow fell softer and the silence turned warm. In the city, a new girl would one day walk into a library, find a dusty letter tucked behind a book, and read the name Anastasia for the first time. She wouldn't know why she felt it, but something in her would stir. And when she closed her eyes that night, she would see a red dress in the snow and a woman waiting to be remembered all over again. Anya lived in St. Petersburg, not far from the broken palaces. Not far from anything, really, just far enough to stay invisible. She worked at a flower shop. Read too many books. Talked to plants more than people. She never liked her last name. Volinskaya. It tasted like history she never signed up for. Her family didn't talk about the past, especially her grandmother. A woman of silence, steel hair, sharp eyes. Anya knew 3 rules about her. Never ask about her childhood, never mention the old palace, and never open the trunk in the attic. Of course, those were the only things Anya ever wanted to do. She didn't mean to open it. Not really. But one night, after her grandmother fell asleep by the fire, mumbling names she never said when she was awake, Anya felt something stir in her chest, like a whisper. She climbed the attic steps, candle in hand, dust clinging to the air like memory. The trunk sat in the corner, quiet, waiting. She lifted the lid. Inside, old cloth, photographs, a military medal, and beneath all that, a journal, leather-bound, untitled. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was strange, beautiful, precise, but not her grandmother's. The first page held only this: "If they burn the crown, hide the love." Anya's breath caught. She turned the page. What followed was not a diary. It was a confession. "My name is Mikhail, and I was never supposed to fall in love with a queen." Anya sat on the attic floor, and as the candle flickered beside her, each page unfolded like a match lit in the dark. The man who wrote it was a soldier, stationed at the palace in 1918, assigned to guard the queen. Not Anastasia, her daughter, a woman lost to time, forgotten in shadow. And Mikhail, he loved her. Anya read until the candle burned low, until her fingers were stained with ink and her chest full of questions. Was it real? A story? A myth? But something inside her had already answered. This wasn't fiction. It was blood. It was hers. The next day, her grandmother said nothing, but her eyes lingered too long on the journal resting in Anya's hands. Anya didn't speak. She only waited. And her grandmother finally whispered, "So you found the ashes." The journal was not clean. It was smudged, worn in corners, its pages edged with time like dried leaves. But every word was alive. Mikhail didn't write like a soldier. He wrote like a man, trying to make sure his love would not be forgotten by a world that had already begun to forget her. Anya read slowly, as if each sentence carried breath, and she was borrowing it. He spoke of her name, but never wrote it. Only called her Z. He said she wore silence like a gown, but when she laughed, it was the sound of something ancient breaking open. Anya smiled softly, imagining the woman he loved. Royal blood, but no crown on her head. Only fire in her hands, and snow in her voice. Mikhail wrote of secret moments, a look across the marble hall, a night in the garden under lanterns, a brush of fingers, too quick to be caught, but too deep to forget. They were not allowed, not even to speak, but they did. Through books, through glances, through ink left on napkins, and poems hidden in boots. Anya turned the page. Her chest was heavy now, not with sadness, with recognition. That night, she dreamed again. But it wasn't like before. This time she stood in a corridor lined with candles. At the end of it, a girl waited, her face hidden in shadow. Anya walked closer. The girl didn't move. But when she reached her, the girl whispered, "He never made it." Anya woke, gasping. It was still dark, still silent. But the voice was real. She felt it in her bones. The next morning, she asked her grandmother, "Did you ever know someone named Z?" Her grandmother paused, then simply said, "There are names we don't speak, because speaking them brings the fire back." Anya asked, "And what about Mikhail?" Her grandmother looked at her for a long time. Then she whispered, "He was your great-grandfather." The journal wasn't fiction. It was a legacy. And suddenly, Anya wasn't reading a stranger's words. She was holding her own history, her bloodline, her fire, her crown beneath the ash. The train was cold, but Anya didn't mind. She carried the journal in her coat, like a heart that didn't beat with blood, but with memory. Mikhail had written of the palace, not as a monument, but as a prison, with music in the walls. He never named its location. But his descriptions were clear. The bell tower with no bell. The garden with white vines. The staircase that curved but never led to anything whole. And Anya found it. Past the hills, through wind-bent pine trees, and snow so soft it swallowed her footsteps. The palace stood in ruin. Half of it burned, the other half frozen in time, like a breath held too long. She walked the same steps he had. Stone cracked under her boots. Ash clung to her coat. She stood in the center hall where he had first seen Z. In the journal he wrote, "She didn't walk like royalty. She walked like a storm that had already made peace with the sea." Anya closed her eyes, and the air changed. It was warmer, fuller, like breath returning to a body that had once been emptied. She opened her eyes again and saw nothing, but felt everything. She followed the trail outside to the side garden. There, beneath the snow, a small metal gate, nearly hidden by thorns. She pushed it open and stepped into a circle of trees. The snow here was untouched, sacred, and in the center, a low stone bench, half covered in moss. She sat, opened the journal, turned to the final pages, and read. Z knew the fire was coming. She told me to leave, to take her words and run. But I stayed. Because love isn't something you carry away. It's something you plant. She said, "If they burn me, I will rise in her. She will carry my voice, even if she doesn't know my name." Anya's breath caught. She flipped the page. There were no more entries. Only a folded slip of paper, taped to the inside of the cover. She unfolded it. A sketch, drawn by Mikhail, of Z, her hair wild in wind, eyes strong, but tired, and her face looked exactly like Anya. The snow fell harder now, but she didn't move, because in that moment, she understood. The girl in her dreams was not someone else. It was her, not just her past, not just her blood, but her calling. She stood from the bench and whispered, "I remember you." And the wind answered back, not in words, but in warmth. The attic was quiet again, dusty, glowing from late afternoon light. But everything had changed. Anya didn't move like a girl, tiptoeing through someone else's story. Now, she moved like someone who knew the story had always been hers. She placed the journal on the table, not to hide it, not to bury it, to begin again. And for the first time, she opened a new notebook, blank, crisp, wide as breath. She didn't start with history. She started with a letter. To the one who hears echoes before words and dreams before names. I know you don't know me, but I know you, because once I didn't know myself either. I thought my name was just a name, that my blood was just quiet inheritance. But now I know my voice was built on the ones they tried to silence. So I am writing to you, the dreamer, the quiet one, the strange one who keeps seeing flames in the snow. You're not broken. You're remembering. She paused, ran her fingers over the edge of the page, and kept going. They will try to convince you it never happened. That love this brave, this forbidden, this free, could not have survived. But it did. It's in the lines you trace, the books you keep, the ache you can't explain. You are the daughter of a storm, the grandchild of ash, the voice they didn't expect to rise. Anya stopped, blinking away the tears, that came like something soft returning to its home. She finished the letter. So when it's your turn, whether you find this in a drawer, a library, or a dream, don't run from it. Write back. Speak louder. And remember, they can burn the crown, but they can't burn the story if you keep telling it. She folded the page, tucked it inside the cover of the journal, and placed both inside a wooden box. She didn't lock it. Just left it there under the window where the light always fell in the afternoon. A place where the next girl might look on a quiet day, searching for herself. That night, Anya dreamed of the palace again. But this time, Z didn't stand in the snow. She stood in sunlight, smiling, hands no longer reaching, but resting. And beside her, Mikhail. Anya didn't cry, didn't speak. She only nodded, and Z nodded back. Because some love stories don't end in holding hands. Some end in passing torches. And Anya had become the flame. It started with a message from a university historian. A woman named Yulia. She had seen Anya's name in an article about rare journals found in forgotten estates. She asked for tea. Just tea. Anya said yes. They met in a small cafe, old wood floors, steam on the windows, a violin playing low from the kitchen radio. Yulia was kind. She wore round glasses and asked questions like someone who didn't just want to know answers, but stories. Anya told her about the journal. Not everything. Just enough. Yulia listened. She didn't interrupt. And when Anya was done, she leaned in. I'd like you to speak at the Winter Archive Conference. About Mikhail. About Z. About what was lost and found. Anya froze. Me? Yulia smiled. No one else could. That night, Anya stood in her room, journal open, notes scattered. Her heart beat too fast. Her thoughts blurred. Could she really do it? Could she say it all out loud, in front of strangers, in a room filled with names, who once erased names like hers? She opened the journal again. The last page. The sketch of Z. Eyes strong. Face soft. She whispered, "What would you do?" And in her chest, something answered, "I already did." The hall was quiet. The morning she stood at the podium. People shuffled papers, tapped phones, whispered politely, until Anya began to speak. She didn't start with facts. She didn't read dates. She began with the letter, the one she had written. To the one who hears echoes before words and dreams before names. And the room fell silent, as if they all, for just a moment, remembered what it felt like to believe in something they were told to forget. She told them about Z, about Mikhail, about love written in silence and passed through blood, like fire waiting for breath. She ended with this: we always think history is behind us, that it's in books, locked away. But sometimes it's in us, sleeping, until we dare to speak it. And sometimes telling the truth is how you bring someone back to life. There was no applause right away, just stillness. Then one hand, then another, and then the room stood, not for Anya, but for Zay, for Mikhail, for the story they had carried. The snow was gentle that morning. No wind, no sound, just light falling like memory. Anya walked the same path again, through the trees, through the frost, through the bones of a palace that once knew music and mourning. She wore a red scarf for aurora, and not bright, not bold, just soft, like remembrance. In her hands, now she carried a new journal, blank. but not empty. On the first page, she had written, "Some stories don't need to be rewritten. They just need to be passed on, with gentler hands." She reached the garden. The old bench still waited. The metal gate creaked, like a voice that hadn't spoken in years. She knelt at the center sec, where the snow melted around her, without touch, and she placed the journal down beneath the same vines where Mikhail once stood watch. She placed it inside a wooden box lined with fabric, a strip from her grandmother's favorite shawl. On top, she added a small stone, carved by hand. It didn't say her name. It didn't say Z's. It said, "You are not forgotten," she whispered aloud. "Not anymore." As she stood, the wind picked up slightly, enough to carry one final sound. A voice, soft, laced with stars. "Thank you." Anya closed her eyes, let it pass through her, like light through stained glass. She didn't cry. She only smiled. Because this was not an ending. It was a continuation. And somewhere, someday, another girl, another boy, another quiet dreamer would find that journal and feel it, the love, the loss, the legacy, rising again like a crown beneath the ash. Alexandria was quiet when it wanted to be. Tourists came for its ruins, for what little the fires hadn't swallowed. But deeper in its belly, beneath crumbling stone, and songs no one sang anymore, there lived a girl named Layla. She was the last of the scribes, not officially. No one gave her a title. But she wrote. On scraps, on mirrors, on her arms when there was nothing else. Words flowed through her like wind through fabric. She didn't speak much, didn't need to. The cats understood her. The wind did too. She lived with her uncle, who ran a shop no one visited, but everyone respected. A room full of books that smelled of lemon, dust, and forgotten truths. Layla's job was to copy, translate, preserve. But sometimes she wrote what wasn't there. Lines in the margins. Stories hidden between official pages. She called them the missing voices. Across the sea, in a city of polished marble and heavy coins, a letter was written. It said, "Clear the ruins. Build a museum. Send the young one, the one who doesn't ask questions." That boy was Omar. He was 17, educated, polite, and completely unaware that the ruins he would step into were still alive. The day he arrived, the city was loud. Too loud. He hated it. He met with officials, signed papers, and by dusk stood before the ruins of what was once the Library of Alexandria. All that knowledge, all that history, now buried, or so they thought. Layla saw him from the rooftop. He looked lost. Sharp clothes, soft eyes. She wrote in a notebook that night, "The boy arrives with dust on his shoes, but no dust in his soul. Not yet." The next day, he stepped into her uncle's bookshop, looking for maps, looking for scrolls. He found her instead, and when she looked up, he forgot what he was supposed to be doing. Because for the first time in his life, a pair of eyes made him feel like a question instead of an answer. The scroll was wrapped in cloth, the color of smoke. It was buried behind a false panel in the floorboards of the shop. Layla wasn't looking for it. She had been sweeping, half listening to the street musicians outside, when her broom knocked the board loose. And there it was, folded like a secret that had waited centuries for the right breath to open it. She unwrapped it, slowly, with the kind of care reserved for dreams and sleeping birds. The writing was older than anything she had copied before. Not Greek, not Arabic, something in between. But her hands knew the shape of it, as if they had written it once in a life that still echoed under her skin. She didn't show her uncle. Not yet. She took it to a rooftop, lit a single candle, and began to read. It spoke of a woman unnamed, a keeper of voices, a guardian of lost love stories. It said, when fire took the library, she ran into the smoke, not for power, not for glory, but to save the names no one ever bothered to write down. Layla held the edge of the scroll, heart pounding. She whispered into the night, you remembered them. And for a moment, the wind turned warm. The next day, Omar returned. He said he was looking for more parchment. Layla didn't believe him. He lingered, asked about her writing, asked about her name. She didn't answer the questions, okay? But she didn't ask him to leave either. She handed him a piece of paper instead, a small one, folded in half. He opened it once he left the shop. It read, history is just memory with better handwriting. That night, he couldn't sleep. His official mission had been simple. Catalog the ruins. Destroy what was unstable. Preserve what was useful. But now, none of it felt simple. He kept seeing her eyes, hearing her silence, feeling like maybe what was buried in Alexandria was not just ruins, but a truth, still breathing beneath the sand. Layla translated more of the scroll. It began to speak of a man. He came with coins in his coat and war in his name, but left with love in his hands and sand in his lungs. She paused, reread it. The words were old, but they felt like prophecy. The scroll spoke gently now, like it knew. Its reader was ready. It told of a girl named Yasmin, a scribe's daughter, who wrote in secret while her city burned, and of Idris, a soldier sent to guard the flames. They met once in the ruins of what had been the women's library. She was there to collect the stories left behind. He was there to seal the gates forever. But when he saw her, he forgot the orders and watched her write instead. It was the same with Layla and Omar. He came again, first for parchment, then for poetry, and then for no reason at all. He stood at the back of the shop, watching her brush ink onto linen, as if the world waited to see what she would say next. Layla didn't smile much, but when she did, he felt it long after she turned away. One day, he brought her a book, an old one, British, mistranslated. He said, this is what they think Alexandria was. She flipped through it and laughed softly. This is a skeleton, she whispered, and not a memory. And he looked at her, like a man realizing he'd never actually seen the ocean until this very moment. She took him to the harbor at sunset. Not the tourist places, not the market, but the edge of the old pier, where the stone still smelled of salt, and the gulls circled like ghosts of scholars. She told him about the whispers, the way the sea sometimes hummed when you read poetry aloud. He didn't ask if she was serious. He just read. And when the waves lifted, he looked at her with wonder, not doubt. She wrote in her notebook that night, he doesn't believe in ruins. He believes in what's left behind. Meanwhile, the scroll grew darker. It spoke of betrayal, of fire, of a secret meeting between Idris and Yasmin the night before the final collapse. She gave him a small clay pendant, etched with unreadable symbols. He kissed her hands, but said nothing, because there was no word for goodbye when your heart still lived in the other. Layla closed the scroll, hands trembling. Omar noticed. What did it say? She looked at him. It said love doesn't always survive, but it always echoes. He said nothing. But the way he looked at her said everything. The letters came in pairs, first from Omar's superiors, then from the city. The message was clear. Demolish the remaining ruins. Clear the foundation. Begin construction. No more delays. No more exploring. No more poetry. Omar stared at the letter. For hours. Each word felt like a weight he didn't remember agreeing to carry. He folded it once, placed it in his coat pocket, and never opened it again. Layla had stopped bringing the scroll to the rooftop. It stayed wrapped now, in layers of linen, beneath her bed. Too many eyes. Too many questions. But she kept reading at night in candlelight flickering like memory in the corner of her room. The next passage was short. It read, "They are coming tomorrow. They will not listen. They do not read. But if you find this, if your hands are warm and your soul still hears the wind, leave. Do not try to save us. Only save the story." She stopped, reread it, felt her chest twist. The past wasn't just speaking. It was warning her. The next morning, Omar returned to the shop. He didn't speak. Didn't bring books or scrolls. Just himself. Layla looked up. Saw the letter in his coat. And said, "When?" He didn't pretend. "Tomorrow." She nodded. "Then come with me." They walked the shoreline to a place where the sand turned dark and the rocks held carvings, older than anyone admitted. She knelt, brushed aside layers of dust and time. There, etched deep into the stone, was the same symbol on the pendant from the scroll. Omar touched it. "What does it mean?" She looked at him. "It means we're not the first. And if we're not careful, we won't be the last either." That night, Omar didn't sleep. He stood at the ruins, where he was meant to place the markers, meant to sign the orders. But all he could see was her hand in the sand, her eyes in the firelight, and a love he hadn't spoken, but already knew too well to deny. Layla returned to the scroll one final time. There, on the last fragment of parchment, was a name written in faded ink. Layla bint Yasmin. She stared at it, fingers shaking. Bint Yasmin? Daughter of Yasmin? It wasn't just a story. It was her family, her bloodline. She was the echo. And Omar was the wind returning. The machines arrived at dawn. Tall, metal-bodied things, with names no one remembered, but power no one questioned. Omar stood at the edge of the site, the demolition notice trembling in his hand. Behind him, officials waited. They said, "Once we begin, there's no turning back." He looked to the sand, thought of Yasmin, of Idris, of Layla's quiet voice, whispering to the wind, and finally said, "Then don't begin." The silence was sharp, the kind that slices before it settles. "You're refusing?" He nodded. "I'm choosing." He turned, walked past them, and toward the ruins, as if they were sacred, because to him they were. At the shop, Layla waited. The scroll was packed now, wrapped in cloth and placed in a satchel, the pendant around her neck. When she saw Omar at the door, Her hands didn't shake. She simply asked, "What did you do?" He said, "What I should have done the moment I met you." She handed him the scroll. "Then let's go." They returned to the ruins, not to fight, but to bury, together. They hid the scroll beneath the old harbor wall, sealed in a box carved with symbols Layla had copied from her family's books. They didn't run. They just left the story where it had always belonged, between the waves and the stone and the silence that never forgets. That night, they sat on the rooftop. No words, just stars. And Omar whispered, "Do you believe in second lives?" Layla smiled. "No." She looked at him. "But I believe in echoes that grow louder when you listen." Somewhere below, in the deep earth, the scroll waited. Not to be read. Not yet. But to call again, one day, to someone who dreamed in the language of ruins and loved like their blood still remembered. The wind was soft that morning, warm, not the usual coastal breeze, but one that moved like breath, like memory, trying to find a voice again. Her name was Amira. She was 16, loved salt on her skin, and walking where no one else cared to look. She came to the old shoreline alone. Always had. The tourists stayed near the polished ruins. She preferred the cracked ones, the wild ones, the places that hadn't been rebuilt because no one knew how. She walked barefoot, her toes sinking in the sand, until she saw something glint near the base of a stone wall. She knelt, brushed the sand aside. A pendant, small, warm, etched with lines that didn't look like decoration. They looked like language. She picked it up, held it in her palm, and the wind whispered her name. Amira. She froze, looked around. No one. Only the sea sighing like it had waited too long to speak again. That night, she dreamt of a woman writing by candlelight, of a boy standing guard near a fire, of ruins and waves, and a scroll wrapped in cloth, as soft as her grandmother's scarf. She woke with a name in her mouth, Layla. And she didn't know why, but it felt like her own. In the attic of her home, she searched for paper, found an old notebook, blank, and she began to write. There was once a girl who wrote in silence, and a boy who listened louder than anyone else. They loved quietly, but their story never stopped, because the wind remembers. And sometimes, when the sand moves just right, it speaks. Thank you for dreaming with us tonight. You've just listened to a love story buried in the sands of Alexandria, where silence held secrets, and the wind carried names too sacred to forget. If your heart feels full, and your mind feels quiet, that means the story found you. We'll be back again soon, with another forgotten tale, another whisper from the past, meant just for you. Until then, rest gently, breathe softly, and remember, some stories never end. They just wait for someone like you to listen. Good night, dreamer.